Today, I want to talk about CARs, controlled articular rotations. So this is something that I learned from functional range conditioning systems a couple years ago, and I've had great success with it myself and with all of my clients, whether it be in the group classes in here at Modern Monkey or even my private training sessions, as well as a lot of my clients that are dealing with rehabbing some sort of injury. So CARS, as I said, stands for Controlled Articular Rotation. So we're going to kind of break that name down and dive into the details of what that means, and then that'll also lead us into why we use it so much here and why I prescribe it so much. So we'll start with that first word, control. Pretty much what it sounds like. We're going to be controlling the movement, and we do this for a couple different reasons. So one reason is that the idea with the CAR is we are trying to communicate with the joint. We're trying to establish communication with that joint, and so you can't do that unless you're actually controlling the joint through some range. Versus like a passive stretch. So a passive stretch being like using some external object, whether it's your own arms to pull until you feel a stretch in a muscle, or even have someone else do it for you, or a band pulling on your arm, etc. So those are all passive ranges. And they have their place for sure, but what we're trying to do, or one thing that we're trying to accomplish with the CARs, like I said, is communicating with that joint, and the only way you can do that is to actually move that joint. So this is going to be a controlled movement. We also do this because we're trying to build more control, and you can't really do that unless you've taken the time to go through that process. And what I mean is, for a lot of people, we'll start with a wrist CAR because it's very simple. It's something that you can absolutely see, and I'll have them doing this wrist CAR, and they're shocked by the type of movement that they can't do, or that as they're doing it, they notice I point out that their entire forearm is moving with it. Right? That's not your wrist. This is your wrist. We only want to see the wrist move. So unless we're active in that situation, we can't build those connections and in the long run build more control. Articular just means the joint. We're dealing with joints with CARs. And when I say joint, what I really mean is the deep down stuff in the joint capsule. And the capsule, you can think of it as the very first layer of connective tissue that surrounds that junction of the two bones coming together, right? This is the very first layer of stuff, and because of that reason, it has an abundance of mechanoreceptors. Mechanoreceptors are these little cells that live in our soft tissue, and they allow communication between the nervous system and the brain with that soft tissue, right? So if it's a muscle, the mechanoreceptors are partly responsible for me being able to tell my arm, bend, right? In that capsular level, that deep down level, we have the most dense population of them. So when we deal with the joint specifically, and we can get down to that level, we can get the most return for our work. We can get the most bang for our buck by dealing with that. We're trying to focus on just that specific joint in that moment. And here's what I mean. Let's say we take the GH joint, the glenohumeral joint, what most people call a shoulder. A CAR looks something like this. Okay, from the side, I'm just making the biggest circle possible, right? We have this idea in our head of what we think our shoulder can do, or what we think it should be able to do, and what is actually happening doesn't quite match up to that, right? So maybe I have someone who comes in and they get to here and they feel like they should be able to go higher, or they saw me demo it higher, so they start to lean back, right? That's a compensation. That's no longer our shoulder moving, that's us compensating with our spine. Then as they start reaching back behind them, this gets a little tough, so they just start twisting from the torso. Again, another compensation. It's tricking us into thinking that our shoulder joint is doing all this movement, but in reality, it's not. And that's very important, because when you start to add that into us trying to do compound movements that involve multiple joints, well, if you have multiple joints and none of them are really capable of doing their job, so they have all these compensations that happen along with it, well, you've got, for lack of better terms, kind of a shit show of things going on there. So by focusing on articular, by focusing on specific joints and making sure that it's just that joint that's moving, we're developing better communication and just better awareness with what our joint is actually capable of in that moment. It's not to say that it can't get better. In fact, if you work on it, it will get better. But this is what it can do now, and we need to be aware of that so that when we get into the middle of a workout or a yoga routine or climbing or whatever it is, we know what that shoulder can do now. And so we know if things start to come up where that might be outside of that range, we're at least aware of it and we can be on the lookout for these compensations, and that's how we can start to fix and even eliminate them. And then lastly, rotation. So why do we do rotation versus just a linear movement, right? Rotation is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck. We're going to get the most return out of that. If you have a clean rotation through a joint, the linear capabilities are going to be there. They're just inherent. You don't have to focus so much on those. Here's what I mean. So if we go back to the GH, right? If I have a really clean looking car, then I don't have to worry about can I get into full flexion or can I get into full extension. I know that I have a car, then I'm good to go. It's those other movements, the linear is implied in the rotational, whereas that's not necessarily the case in reverse. Rotational is not implied in linear. Just because I can lift my shoulder to here doesn't mean anything about what I can do back here. So rotation gives us more information. It allows us to get to that deep capsule. It allows us to get down to that deep down stuff and access all those mechanoreceptors. All right, so now that we've talked about what a CAR is and what it means, why do we do them? Well, go back to the video I posted last week where I'm talking about lack of movement in modern day culture and how it's presenting us some problems. This is one small way that we can start to sprinkle in more movement throughout our day. I've already talked about how cars allow us to get the most bang for our buck. So yeah, you've got a 9-to-5 job, you've got kids and stuff. You don't have time to go run around for hours jumping and chasing after things and throwing things and all that stuff. But you do have a couple minutes every hour even to just stand up and get 1 or 2 cars. Standing in line at the grocery store. It can be standing at the bank. It could be maybe you set an alarm at your office and you just stand up from your chair and you get a couple hip cars. There are plenty of ways that you can do this, and cars is a very simple way to start integrating more movement into our life so we can at least maintain what joint range of motion that we do have. All right, so in addition to just getting more movement in our day, doing cars regularly also allows us to establish better communication with our joints. When's the last time you took 5 minutes and just really sat and tried to figure out what your wrist could do? This is giving us a couple minutes each day to just establish better connection. And just by trying over and over to establish that connection, it will get cleaner and it will get better, and you'll be able to control a larger range, and you'll also be able to do it without all those compensations that you'll probably find in the beginning you have going on. I always tell my clients, don't get upset by this, especially the spine work. Spine stuff can be tricky, and it's very easy to get frustrated and feel like you're not making any progress. And I always refer to Kill Bill, and that very intro scene in the movie where she's laying in the hospital bed and she's just going, wiggle your big toe, wiggle your big toe.
Wiggle your big toe. Hard part's over.
That's what a lot of cars is. You're just trying to figure out, what is it I'm trying to do with my scapula right now? And why is my head doing this weird thing as I do it, right? Or as I'm doing my toes, why are my hands getting all clenched together? So you'll start to see a lot of these compensations, as well as just other joints that kind of tag along for these movements and that you're not necessarily aware of. And when you're in a workout under a high intensity environment, under a load, you don't want those other things happening. And then a final reason I use these with a lot of my clients, if they've already had an accident or an injury, this is a great rehab once they have been cleared by their doctor or their PT to start moving the joint. One of my members here, still coming back from an Achilles repair, a partial rupture that they had. Once they got cleared to actually move the ankle through a bigger range of motion, we started having them do cars immediately, also having them do some toe lifts and drills of that nature. It's great for rehab, because in communicating with that joint and moving it through a full range of motion, we're essentially telling our body this is what we want to be able to do with this joint, and the body is going to respond by laying down tissue, and not just laying down tissue, but laying it down in the proper direction so that it can do those movement patterns. And what I mean by that is we've all heard the term or the phrase scar tissue. In clinical situations, it's more referred to as fibrotic tissue. But essentially by doing CARs, we are helping to prevent an excess amount of that getting laid down, and we're also helping to smooth out what has been laid down, start to clean up some of that stuff so the joint can act like a normal joint again. Okay, so now that we're done talking about it, here is what my full body morning routine looks like, sped up. This took me about 5 minutes and 40 seconds, and this is 3 reps at every joint. So not a big deal, not a hard thing to throw in the mornings to get ready for the day. If you're interested in learning more, stay tuned.